Okay, so as far as the progress on the grading, hopefully I'll finish everybody's second question today. I don't see any reason that I wouldn't. I'm fairly close right now. Um, I was grading this morning and did not realize that something was wrong with the rubric. So when I was giving you, like if I gave you 7 points, it would give you 0.7 rather than 7. So I think that I fixed it. I definitely went back into the grade book and corrected those grades. So if you saw that earlier and that was distressing to you, I could see why. And it should be fixed now, hopefully. Yeah, I don't know why it didn't just use the last rubric, but I must have done something that I didn't intend to do. All right. So, do you guys have any questions or concerns or comments about anything before we get started? Anything from the reading? As I'm kind of wrapping up the moral liberty versus natural liberty questions, what I'm noticing is, I don't know, you're kind of sort of defining what those things are. You're saying one is bad and one is good, one is evil and one is better, but maybe not explaining how you decide which is which. So moral liberty is when you accept the restraints of the Bible so that what you do doesn't cause harm to other people. Natural liberty is just the idea that you're a free agent. You can do whatever you want. Nobody really tells you what to do. You just live your life, the way you want to live your life. And it's not necessarily that your goal is to be evil, although they certainly saw it as evil. It's more that you're making your own rules as you go, that sort of idea. So, and it's not necessarily that you're intending to do harm, it's just you're naturally doing harm. Also, one of the things that I noticed in that answer is you guys kept calling people Roger and Ann. So you don't get to call them Roger and Ann unless you actually know them. So when you talk about historical people, you've got to use their last names, or you could use both names like Anne Hutchinson or Roger Williams, or you could say Mr. Williams and Ms. Hutchinson if you like, or you could just say Hutchinson and Williams, but you shouldn't say Roger and Anne because it sounds like your neighbors or, your friends, people you know, which you don't know them. So yeah. It's a little different because they're not characters in a novel. In a novel, it's legit. You can do that. Also, somebody, I don't know that it was this class because I saw it last night, emailed and asked if I would give them feedback on their answers. Now, every time I grade one of your submissions, I do put feedback in the rubric. So I'm assuming you can see that, but again, my side looks different than your side. I should probably go in and see if I can figure out where the feedback shows up, but I type it into the rubric. So my guess is if you go back into the assignment and click on it, that you'll be able to see the feedback. Now, I might just go back and paste it and send it to you, but you should be able to see it. And I fill in feedback when I grade them. So hopefully that'll help you in some way. It's why I do it, so that maybe you can read it and notice that I want more detail or more explanation or more of the why. That's one of the things I was noticing with the second answer was there wasn't as much why did they think this, why did it matter, yeah, the why. We care about the why, of course. All right. Let's look at the weekly question and then, okay, make sure I've got the weekly question instead of my comments about the weekly question. All right, how and why, excuse me, it's allergies again. How and why tobacco planters in the Chesapeake region came to rely on African slaves. I'm so sorry about the yawn. African slaves rather than European indentured servants over the course of the 17th century. Just to mention. 17th century, that'd be 1600s. So like 19th century, 1800s, 20th century, 1900s. We're in the 21st century now. Okay, at what point did the Chesapeake become a slave society rather than merely a society with slaves? So, and that point is probably going to be around the time where you notice that there's more slaves than indentured servants, and they stop in using or inviting, or I don't know what the right word is, but purchasing the services of indentured servants. So, all right. Oh, someone's coming in. Let me check them off. All right. So let's look at the notes for the day. All right. All right, and I think we talked quite a bit about Bacon's Rebellion last time. And, you know, the book is going to assert that that era is right about the time that you see the switch, because of all of these rebellions from people who live within the colonies because they're not able to get land. And then the people who use, the rich guys, the big landowners who use the services, who use the services of either slaves or indentured servants, decide they just don't want to mess with the difficulties of giving people land, them rebelling, them getting rights. It also means that they're probably going to end up having to share wealth and power with other people. And, you know, they're not feeling super democratic about that kind of stuff. Their thought really is, if I don't have to share with other folks, then I have more wealth and power. So that's kind of what's going on there. So as far as the textbook, good place to look for some discussion about the rise of slavery and the exchange of indentured servants from indentured servants to slaves. I mean, the book does do a nice job with the subject headings to give you a good idea of where to look. So if you start on page 98 and then you go through, well, there's a section that says the rise of slavery, of Chesapeake slavery. That's going to be, you know, a section that's pretty useful to you as well. And in that section, it talks about Bacon's Rebellion. So you start on page 92 and work your way through about 104, 5, 6, somewhere in there. Because it does talk about the consequences of Bacon's Rebellion and King Philip's War, that sort of stuff, becoming the rise, as in part as the rise of slavery. And it even says, like here it says, to avert the further growth of a rebellious population of landless former indentured servants, Virginia authorities accelerated the shift to slaves who would never become free. As Virginia reduced the number of indentured servants, it redefined their freedom dues to include 50 acres of land. All right, so it's going to tell you very specifically, and as I've mentioned to you more than once, the questions that I give you really do come directly from the book and the subject headings, that kind of stuff. So if you look there, it should be relatively simple to find the answers. And also be sure and look there. There were a few people whose answers really came directly from the internet. And we do love the internet, I understand that, but, you know, textbook, come on, you know, Dr. Foner, he knows what he's talking about. Okay, so slavery, replacing indentured servitude is the main focus of your question. And King Philip's War, I think we mentioned briefly before. I know somebody's internet is having some trouble, isn't it? Letting some people in, hopefully. All right, I think we mentioned before that King Philip's War, Metacomet natives who are concerned that their tribe, their their families are becoming too dependent upon the English for trade, that it's changing their culture, and they see this as a chance to push the English out. And this is more in Massachusetts and Connecticut. So this is more against the Puritans than the folks in Virginia. But what they'll do is suppress the natives and push them farther west. So once they're defeated, part of the deal is they've got to move farther west, and you'll start to see that as a trend in U.S. history. And somebody also wrote in their question about moral versus natural liberty that part of the reason that there is huge conflict between Puritans and Native Americans is because of their different definitions of liberty. And maybe, but it probably had as much or more to do with land, especially once they started growing stuff. In Virginia, that tobacco is really hard on, well, anywhere, it's not just Virginia, but tobacco is hard on the soil. So it robs the nutrients of the soil. So unless you plant some complementary plant that puts back the nutrients that the tobacco takes out, it ruins the soil. So you're constantly having to get new land. I don't mean every year, but probably every 10 years or so. And they don't know as much then about which plants to plant together to kind of help each other out. I honestly have no idea what you would plant with tobacco to complement that and replenish the soil. Apparently there must be something, because they still use the same land over and over to grow tobacco in the modern era. But they didn't know, and they kept pushing farther west. Plus, more and more people were coming. So, the more people from England and, well, other countries too, but from Europe, who showed up and took land, the less land there was going to be available for Native Americans. So they certainly did have conflict about religious laws and liberty and that sort of stuff. Also, just since I'm thinking about it, Puritans and salvation, because a bunch of people, not a bunch, but several people wrote in their answers that you had to follow moral law to go to heaven. And Puritans have really kind of an odd belief about how people go to heaven. It's also why they don't try to convert people, even though for whatever reason students just assume that they do. They believe that you are predestined to go to heaven or hell. So it's already decided before you're born. So you've just got to figure it out, like if you're going to heaven or hell, but there's nothing you can do to change it. That's already been set in stone. So, it is possible that somebody was predestined to go to heaven and they could come out and be a horrible person. It's not exactly how the Puritans saw it, but they did believe in predestination. So they didn't think, like, I've got to go to church every week so I can go to heaven, or I've got to say these prayers so I can go to heaven. I have to have this religious devotion so I can go to heaven. They thought that was already predetermined. They did think that if you liked going to church, liked prayer, liked reading the Bible, that it's possibly a sign that you are one of those who's predestined to go to heaven. Is part of why they were so nervous. They also didn't, because they're always wondering, like, am I going to heaven or am I going to hell? So they aren't those people who believe in like salvation by faith, where it's just like, I just believe in Jesus, therefore I'm going to heaven. And they're not even, folks who believe that you can earn your salvation by good works. They're not even, they don't know, it's predestined. They're just hoping it's them. And they figure they'll know it's them because they're Puritans, because, the God, of course, would have called Puritans to himself, and that they would enjoy religious practice. But their concern about moral liberty is that setting an example, that city upon a hill sort of thing. And that if you practice natural liberty, that your liberty can harm other people. Like maybe your natural liberty says that you should have, I don't know, all of the land in the area. So you take all the land in the area, but that harms the people you take the land from. That's probably not the best example, but there it is. All right, okay. Back to King Philip's War, Bacon's Rebellion. And we were gonna talk about the Jacob Leisler thing, I think is where we were headed from last time. And I think we might have mentioned that back in the homeland, James II replaced Charles. Charles was a Church of England devotee, and James II was Catholic. So people were worried that he was going to push the country back to Catholicism. So then he was forced out through the Glorious Revolution. Sorry, I couldn't think of it, and there it is. Led by William and Mary, who are parts of a different royal family. These folks marry, they're a married couple. They make a deal with the people who own the land, with wealthy landowners and prominent political people, that if they help them get the throne, that they'll recognize their rights to help rule, and they'll also pass that Toleration Act. So they passed the English Bill of Rights, which recognizes certain rights for people with property, gives them the ability to continue in the Parliament. It gives a power sharing agreement between the Parliament and the Crown, so the legislature and the royal family. And the English Toleration Act is going to ensure that you can worship however you want. By that, they mean Catholic or Protestant. But the Church of England would continue as the official Church of England. And then I believe James II ends up in Scotland. So they don't kill him or anything. And they call it the Glorious Revolution because no one dies. So that's glorious. And they just make a power sharing agreement that has to do a lot with money as well. But in the Americas, in the colonies, for some reason, people die. Not so many, but at least one. There's this fellow named Jacob Leisler that your book will talk about a little tiny bit, but there's more written about him elsewhere. And he really likes William and Mary. He doesn't like James II. So he takes over some fort in New York before William and Mary ascend to the throne. And after they ascend to the throne, he won't give the fort back. And so the colonial authorities say, like, hey, you got to give the fort back. He goes, no, I will not. I've taken it in the name of William and Mary. And then they tell him, like, dude, William and Mary are the king and queen now, so you can give it back. He goes, no, I will not. I've taken the fort in the name of William and Mary. And they try to convince him, and he won't be convinced. And they say, dude, if you don't give it back, we're going to have to capture you, and we're going to convict you of treason. And then that end is not good. So he goes, no, I will not relinquish the fort. I took it in the name of, okay, so they can't convince him, so they capture him and they do a public execution. Now, later on, they'll pardon him, but you know, once you're dead, the pardon is not that useful. And this gets written about in history books sometimes because of how they executed him in a public way. They eviscerate him. They, you know, cut him open down the middle and take out parts of him while he's still alive. So it's, you know, people wrote about it because it's extremely unusual and gross and cruel. It was cruel as well. That's way worse than gross, isn't it? But he's the only fellow who gets killed. The Edmund Andrews, the governor of the Dominion of New England, would have if they hadn't gotten him out of town pretty fast. So they returned him to England so that he doesn't get killed. So in the American colonies, the English Toleration Act leads to the dissolution of the Dominion of New England. Jacob Leisler doesn't end well for him, but freer worship within the Bible Commonwealth. So in the middle colonies, there's not as much repression or suppression of different Christian religious groups. More secular determination of voting rights. By that, secular is like not church, okay? So in Massachusetts and Connecticut primarily, in those colonies where maybe before you had to be a church member to be able to vote, they got rid of that requirement. Also, in some of those colonies, part of your tax is paid for the minister. So they're starting to move away from that. Not completely in all of those places, but in several of those places, starting to move away from that. And then they're having appointment of royal governors. So it's not that they get rid of the legislatures necessarily, but they'll have a royal governor, and then the legislature and the royal governor will work together. And in theory, it's going to mirror what's going on back in England, where the king and queen hold some power, but the legislature holds some power as well. It's a little trickier because it's the American colonies, and those are supposed to be run for the benefit of the mother country, mercantilism, how we started the chapter out. But the rich landowners always, they always want a voice in what they're doing. And of course, the landowners in the American colonies see themselves as British citizens, which will be a point of contention as we move toward the French and Indian War. All right, so at the end of the Dominion of New England, you see William and Mary come to power. You see more secular determination of voting rights, so you don't have to be a church member to vote in those Puritan colonies, and freer worship, so less suppression of worship, with the strange exception, of course, of the Salem witch trials, which is a brief excerpt in colonial history. And we've talked about the Salem witch trials before, I know that we have, but I guess we'll talk about them again. And this is when, as you're probably aware, people within Salem, which is in Massachusetts, a village, so it's not the whole state, and it's not even, or excuse me, it's not the whole colony, not even a big part of the colony, but the Salem witch trials occur in Salem, Massachusetts, and because they got to govern themselves, they really could not be told by the rest of the colony that they needed to cut things out. So nobody really listened to them, I'm sorry, they didn't really listen to people from, say, Boston or other communities who said, you've got to cut out this witch thing. Okay, so we've talked about the Salem witch trials a bunch, but just as a reminder, you've got 200 people accused of witchcraft, and eventually they're most of them older women, financially independent, so they maybe seem a little too out of control. They're not listening to the authority of the men in the community, perhaps. There's all sorts of theories about why this stuff happens. 19 were eventually executed. They used spectral evidence, visions, dreams, that sort of thing, until somebody had a vision or dream that the mayor's wife was a witch. And again, I know that we mentioned this before. More of the idea of suppressing witches, executing witches, that thing was really trendy in Europe, Not quite as trendy in the Americas, although we clearly had our moment, didn't we? And I know that I've mentioned this before, but the more scholarly Puritans really urged Salem to stop doing this. And you don't see that nearly as often after the witch trials. And this is 1690, so end of the century. Okay, and the book covers this pretty well in a paragraph or two. And then stuff I didn't really make as many notes about. I don't know what I was thinking, but you should still pay attention to the end of the chapter, where they start to talk about diversity within the colonies. So what you will notice is that more people from more places are moving to the American colonies. So the book has a really nice little map. Let me see, I'll show you the map. I know you can see it. See, nice map. Where it shows you the origins of the colonies, and it mentions all the different countries that they were from. And, most of them are English and French and German and Dutch, but there are also people who are Scots-Irish. There are people who are from different sections of Scotland, and it mentions some Norwegian, Swedish kind of dudes as well. So you start to see a more diverse group of folks moving to the Americas. And part of the reason they're attracting settlers is they are advertising a little, and also different religious minorities in different European countries are coming. It mentions a lot of Germans are coming, especially from the Rhine River region, and a lot of these are Lutherans who are living in more Catholic areas, or maybe Catholics who are living in more Lutheran areas. A lot of these folks have a little bit of money, so they come and they're able to buy land. And you see a lot of the German migrants coming to Pennsylvania, especially Western Pennsylvania, and later on the Pennsylvania Dutch, which are really Deutsch because they speak German. And oh, there's that discussion in the book, Who is an American, from the Ben Franklin. And one of the things that Ben Franklin will note is he's not super fond of Germans. He's just not. I don't know if he gets over it ever, but he's not. And if you want to think of the the American colonies as a melting pot, yeah, I don't know. And the book's going to mention that too. It's not that everybody liked each other and necessarily got along. They typically came and lived in their own communities. So there's a lot of diversity in the Americas. It doesn't necessarily mean that every group liked each other. And Native Americans have got to deal with this because people are coming over by the thousands, and eventually the population really increases dramatically. And it's a problem for Native Americans who are much smaller in number. So, and they're starting to become more dependent on trade with Europeans. They're starting to, I guess, integrate some European cultures within their lifestyle, which is part of the reason some of their leaders are going to start to push back on that, because they feel like they're losing their autonomy and their independence. You'll also notice a couple of tribal groups will try to become more European or to adopt some European customs so that they'll be better accepted by the Europeans and perhaps live in peace. The most notable group of Native Americans to do that would be the Cherokee. And they're part of the group that they refer to as the 5 civilized tribes, because they'll adopt more European styles of government with elected assemblies and written constitutions and that sort of stuff. If you're wondering, does that help them keep their land? You know the answer to that. I know you know the answer to that. It also is going to mention that people are starting to become used to consumer goods that they import from England. So shopping is a big deal in the Americas. And I think that's kind of a trend always in what becomes the United States, is we buy a lot of stuff. And they'll also point out that especially in cities like Philadelphia and New York, you'll see the rise of artisans and craftsmen who will produce paintings and furniture and things that look like the things you could buy in England. So there'll be homegrown replicas of things you could buy in England. Yeah. So trade's going to become important. And also, they'll mention that you can trade and buy things from other countries as well. But a lot of that trade needs to be controlled through English shipping. But because the coastline is so long, it's really easy to find ways around rules about English shipping. There you go. And it mentions too that a lot of the food that's made in the colonies is shipped to the Caribbean or Caribbean, and that there's what probably was referred to in your 8th grade class as the triangle trade, which wasn't exactly a triangle, but the stuff that was exported from our part of the Americas, from what becomes the United States, is going to be bread and flour. What else did they export? Tobacco, some, fish and grain, and especially fish off the New England coast. They would catch it and dry it and send it. And then from the Caribbean, it's sugar and rum. sugar and rum, and then slaves go to the Caribbean, and then manufactured goods from England. So, all right. And then what you'll also start to see develop in the American colonies is the different social classes. So especially in the plantation colonies, you'll see the very, very wealthy families, and you won't see much in the middle. And then you'll see very, very poor white people, and then you'll see slaves. In some of the middle colonies, Pennsylvania, and the former Puritan colonies, Massachusetts and Connecticut, you'll see a whole lot more in the middle. And then they'll mention in, well, even in Pennsylvania, New York, even in the Puritan colonies, there'll be certain families that will sort of rise to the top of society. In the Puritan colonies, it's not as much about wealth, but it's some about wealth. In in New York and Pennsylvania, it's probably as much about land owning as anything else. And these guys are probably more farmers, probably more farmers. Lots of farmers in rural New York. And of course, in New York City, what becomes New York City, then it's people who are in control of the financial industries are going to be seen as the top of the social structure, but it always has something to do with money. It's not always completely about money, but it's, it's about money. And what you'll notice as well, and the book talks about it, if you're in those moneyed classes or you're in those prominent families, people are really concerned about who you marry. And so you have a lot of rules, you have a lot of rules because you're not just having a romantic relationship. There's sort of a merger between your very prominent family and perhaps somebody else's prominent family. So you can't just marry someone because you like them. They have to be like you, which probably means same social class. It does mean same social class. So they're going to have at least as much money, about the same amount of money, and probably have the same religious beliefs as your family as well. So if you're poor, nobody cares who you marry. I mean, that's just the truth. So, if you married Native American, no one would care if you were poor. The only way you get to marry Native American if you're rich was the John Rolfe Pocahontas kind of thing. But you have to stay within your social class. And if you're wealthy, you're going to marry someone who looks like you. If you're poor, no one cares. Now, that's going to change over time. For a variety of reasons. Also, they do mention that even though there's a lot of ethnic diversity within the colonies, one of the things that really unites the colonies is, two, I should say, trade and language. English is going to be the language of commerce. So people are going to learn to speak English, whether it's their native language or not. So Germans who want to be successful in business will learn English. And Native Americans who want to be successful traders will learn English. So English is going to be one of the things that unites everybody within the colonies. Yes. Okay. And the more trappings of the upper class that you had, the more esteemed you tended to be. And the way that they knew that you were wealthy is if you could send your kids overseas for school. Yes, they didn't go to some William and Mary College or some, University of Pennsylvania. You didn't do anything like that. You didn't even go to Harvard or Yale. That wasn't cool enough for you. You had to go back to, especially England or Scotland, for school. And as time goes along, the Southern folks will want their kids to go to French schools, but not yet. I think I know not yet. Once we're out of the colonial phase, once we become a country, you'll see the South start sending their kids to French schools, but not during the colonial phase. No. All right, and let's see, what else do we want to say? Land is primarily the means of wealth during this time period, but you already knew that, and very hard to attain wealth if you don't have land. So the thing that's going to guarantee that you're poor is not owning land or not owning a business. And in most colonies, it's pretty hard to own land unless you go farther west. It's part of the reason the Germans just went to Western Pennsylvania, because that way they could be left alone. Scots-Irish, kind of the same. And the book is going to point out that while there was a lot of poverty in the Americas, it wasn't the same as the poverty that you saw back in England, because England had become such an urban society and most people were landless anyway. If you lived in a city and couldn't get a decent wage job, which is possible, likely, there's going to be this really obvious abject poverty within the cities, because the US, or what becomes the US, the American colonies are much more rural. Most people, well, not most people, but many people own land, and it's a farming economy, and there's a lot of farmland available. There's not the same sort of poverty as there is in England or France, in communities that are in countries where most of their population lives in the city. I would also want to mention to you, oh, look at the book. The book's so useful. I would also mention to you that during this era, England and France have really become focused on population within the cities. So more people live in the cities than in the country in England and France. That is not going to be true at any point in the history that we talk about this semester. So that doesn't even happen before the Civil War in the United States. So this idea that everyone lives in the city, that most of the population is there, which leads to urbanization, which leads to a different sort of poverty, that doesn't happen in the United States for a very long time. It doesn't happen until after the Civil War. It happens during the Gilded Age is when you start to see that. So in the early years, well, more than the first half of the United States, because we're an agriculturally based society and it's such a vast country and there's so much land available. I know Native Americans would not agree with that assessment, but because you can move west and find land, people aren't as poor. They don't have the same sort of poverty as they have in the urban centers in England and France, especially London and Paris. Those places are pretty rough. All right, so the end of that chapter, which apparently I didn't think was worth notes, really talks about how the colonies are becoming more diverse. They're really unified by language and trade. And the language of trade is English. So if you can't speak English, you probably are not going to make as much money. But they're still going to have, and you'll notice this even in the early American days, they'll have newspapers in the native languages of everybody who comes over. So, not everything's in English all the time, but for you to be successful in business, English needs to be your language. Just does. Okay. All right, I'm going to stop for just a sec and see if you guys have any questions, comments, concerns. Is there anything you guys want to ask about? Okay, I'm going to drink water while you think about it, because I know you're thinking about it. Okay. So anything you want to ask about? Now, I'm assuming that you guys saw the list of stuff to study. Let me see if I can find the list of stuff to study and share it with you. We could look over that for a sec. Because next week is your quiz. Woohoo, first quiz. Super exciting. Okay, or maybe not. Maybe it's terrifying. I don't know. Okay. All right. So the quiz review. So these quizzes are 16 to 20 questions, probably be 20. And I think I know that they're worth 40 points. So they'll be equal to your weekly questions. Also, the way that I think about the weekly question is apparently not the same way some of you think about it. Because again, I had some people whose answers were about the same length as the question. My thought is I'm asking you to answer one question in an entire week of a college class. Therefore, your answer should be very thorough because you know what the question is ahead of time. There's no mystery. You get to use your textbook. So if you're not explaining stuff, if you're just listing stuff, if you're not telling me why stuff's important, in my way of thinking, you're not doing your job because you know the question ahead of time and you've got resources. And while I recognize a lot of you are probably waiting until about 11 at night on a Friday to turn stuff in, you didn't have to. You know, you knew the question ahead of time. So the fact that you choose to do that, and I'm not discounting how busy your lives are and how many classes you have, that sort of stuff. I'm just saying, you know the question ahead of time. We've gone over it in class. You've got a textbook. So you writing an answer that's like 3 or 4 lines long, you know, the same length as the question's not acceptable. So I might have given you 5 or 6, you know, on your first 2 questions for doing that. I bet as we move along, I won't give you quite as many points. So you got to do a little better if you got like 4, 5, or 6. Okay. And if you're in the 8 or 9 range, you're where you need to be. You're good. Okay. But details and explanation always good. Okay, back to the quiz review. So I made a list of stuff that if I were you, I would look over before I took the quiz. So this is posted on the course documents page, which is where you should find all sorts of exciting things, including a sample question and answer. But for the first chapter, just general tribal characteristics, material, social, spiritual. Be sure you know what the Columbian Exchange is, difference in how the English and Spanish versus the French and Dutch treated natives. Because I divided them that way, that's probably a sign that I think they should be grouped together, that they have some characteristics that are more similar, like English and Spanish. Maybe bring over more people, some more military, potentially. They take over more land. So they're more about taking over the land and colonizing. French and Dutch are more about trading. Yeah. And the Spanish are a little more harsh about how they convert folks than, say, the French. The Dutch are not converting folks. In some instances, the English are, and most they're not really. Even though in everybody's mind, the Puritans come over and try to convert the natives. They really don't. I mean, they do want them to change how they live because honestly, they just don't wear enough clothing. Heathens. But they don't want to change them because they want them to go to heaven and they're trying to convert them. They just don't want them to tempt other people, you know, English people. All right. Concerns and reasons for De las Casas, concerns about Spanish colonization. So was slavery a sin? Is killing folks a good way to convert people? That sort of thing. Chapter 2, make sure you know what a pilgrim is, a Puritan, a Quaker, and a Catholic. They're not all the same, although pilgrims are a subset of Puritans. I am aware of that. Make sure you know what's going on, Chesapeake versus New England. So Chesapeake are the let's grow tobacco, and we've got indentured servant and slave colonies, and New England is more Puritans, Dutch, those folks who probably land-based, not as many slaves, and then some commerce, financial stuff. And make sure you know the difference between indentured servitude and slavery. And for chapter 3, mercantilism, navigation acts to restrict trade to the home base, to the mother country. Make sure you know how New York, Pennsylvania, the Carolinas, and Maryland started and how they're a little different. Mercantilism, navigation acts. Apparently I like that. I put it in twice. Importance of enlightenment, great awakening, which we didn't really talk about so much, but we'll hit that a little harder next time. Although we can talk about it for a couple minutes. Details and importance of the Salem witch trials, and you've seen that a couple of times. Growing religious, economic, and ethnic diversity. So we're talking enlightenment and great awakening. Enlightenment is more of that intellectual movement that's occurring in Europe. And you'll see more of this as we go along. It comes up again in the next chapter, so we'll talk quite a bit about it next time. But enlightenment is a more science-based, rational thought revolution within Europe, and it's a push away from religion potentially. Some people saw it that way, or a push away from anything that doesn't embrace learning and science. So some people saw that as a rejection of God or tradition, that sort of stuff. So you saw something called the Great Awakening, which was really a call back to church and back to religious fervor, that sort of thing. And all of this is going on at the same time that you have that conflict between King Charles, then King James, and then William and Mary. So you've got a lot of political turmoil, which leads to some spiritual turmoil, which leads to some intellectual turmoil, just a lot of turmoil. So all of these things are happening around the same time period. And some reaction to that, really part of the reason you have the witch trials all throughout Europe is it's a pushback against that in more rural areas and less, we'll just go with rural. It hardly ever happens in cities. It's not really a city phenomenon, but it's part of that urban-rural divide that you start to see during this time period. And the difference in what their beliefs and their education can be. That is not to suggest that every urban area is very, very sophisticated during this time period or any time period. Not really saying that, but your chances of having books and hearing new ideas, that sort of thing, really are bigger in cities in that era. And cities tend to be kind of the home of culture and art and that sort of stuff, just because the population is larger. So there's more folks. All right, and then we'll talk about the chapter 4 stuff next week, but Stoner Rebellion, Atlantic slave trade, why do we get Georgia, liberalism versus republicanism, salutary neglect, which is super important concept, and then Enlightenment, Great Awakening, and 7 Years' War. So, and I know you're thinking, she said there's only 20 questions. I did, but I don't want to make it too easy for you. All right. Okay, before we wrap it up for today, we still have a little bit of time. Do you guys have any questions or comments? Is there anything you're concerned about? Anything you want to ask questions about?